Hey guys, Zomfox here, and today it's time to do the Week 4 review of the 2023 USFL season. This week was a very, very important week in seeing exactly where some teams rank up. We had the number 1 and number 2 teams in the league going against each other, as well as a couple other games that were very important to see which teams truly could actually start, a comeback in the season and which couldn't. So, without further ado, let's get started with the scores. The scores ended up being the Gamblers beating the Stars 41-16. The Showboats beat the Panthers 29-10. The Breakers in the 1v2 against the Generals ended up winning 20-17 in a very close battle. Another close game was the Stallions versus the Maulers, which ended 24-20. As for the Houston versus Philadelphia game, this game was one that was very, very easy to predict in a sense, as if you just followed the trends, you could see how this was going. The Gamblers beat the Stars and it wasn't even close. Look, I didn't expect it to be this bad a blowout, but a blowout, I'm not surprised it happened. Gamblers held the ball for like 10 more minutes, and it's getting kind of redundant. What did you expect? The Stars running the ball well? That's unheard of this year. The Gamblers running the ball well? That's all they do. The Gamblers ran the ball substantially better than the Stars did. 134 yards for their leading rusher versus 16 yards. Come on. And the fact is that Kenji Bahar actually outplayed Case Cookus, which, yes or no, bad O-line in the Stars. But look, Kenji Bahar played a lot better. He played a very clean game, and he ended up having a very solid game due to that. And the fact is he got hurt at the end, but it didn't even matter because Terry Wilson came in and, played as a, quarterback in the last quarter. He didn't do much. Look, this is a really easy game to call and ended up basically going exactly as expected. The Gamblers completely pwned the Stars in basically every single way. So, yeah, Stars are the worst team in the league. Gamblers are all of a sudden 500 and looking to be one of the teams competing for a playoff spot in the South. So, then we have the second game being the Showboats versus the Panthers. Kind of a weird game in a sense because I still don't really look at it as the Showboats are the better team. That's why I didn't put them above the Panthers in the power rankings. Because the Panthers had 4 turnovers, which is a huge reason why they lost the game. Look, the Panthers hadn't been turnover prone all year. They hadn't. So they had one game, they had one slip up. And I think a huge reason for that is their reluctancy to actually make a QB change. Because no, going from 1.5 quarters to a quarter to a 1.5 quarters, not a quarterback change. That's a I have no idea what I'm doing type of change. That isn't, Mike Riley last year alternating drives between Perez and Johnson. That's not benching a quarterback to see how the other guy plays. I firmly expect Strong to be the starting quarterback this week. If he's not, that's bad. Bad for the Panthers. Because when you look at it, the fact was this game was very close. In fact, you could say that in all facets of the game, the Panthers were better. Yards per play, they were a bit worse. But essentially passing the ball, the Panthers did it on a more efficient level in terms of, completion percentage. They just had less yards per attempt. Ran the ball substantially better than the Showboats. But the turnovers hurt them, and that's why they ended up losing the game. Now, as for the important game, it was the Breakers versus the Generals. This was for essentially the number 1 team in the league, and ended up being the number 1 and 2 team still because of how close a game it was. This was definitely probably the closest game all year. It was a very tight-knit game throughout the whole time, and ended up being that the Generals lost. Because when you look at it, it was really insane this game was even close. And it was very weird when you look at all the stats. The Breakers absolutely destroyed the Generals in time possession. Nearly 20 minutes better than the Generals. The Generals, though, like they've been doing, averaged over 7 yards a play, which is insane. But their total plays was lacking. They had 39 of the Breakers' 70, despite both having the same amount of drives. And that's where you see the very important fact of the passing. Look, I know the Generals are a running team, and I still believe that is more important, being good at running than being good at passing. It's just when you go against a team that passed the way the Breakers did is where you see the issue. Because look at the rushing as well. The Generals did far better running the ball. They averaged nearly 8 yards a carry. They had 170 total yards on 22 attempts. They obliterated the Breakers. But passing, the Breakers did something very smart, I would say. The Breakers ended up doing a lot of these short type of passes, short screens, slants, all that kind of stuff, to where that there wasn't really an insanely long reception. I believe the longest reception of the game for the Breakers was like 33. And aside from that, they didn't have like any others above maybe like 20. So the Breakers did this short passing game to kind of be that fake running game to where they were able to use passing to actually chew the clock to harm the Generals. Usually the Generals are able to win these games by playing great defense and running the ball, basically playing, classic 80s football. But the Breakers did a new modern age twist on that by passing the ball like a running attack and being able to do that to eat up a ton of clock. The fact is that I think that a big reason why the Generals weren't able to put up a ton of points is that the fact that it was a weird game. Yeah, they had 11 drives, they could have scored more, but the Breakers played this truly smart. One turnover each, so it's not even a turnover battle. It was just that the Breakers were able to eat clock by doing a very, very strategic and smart way to go. I think this is a huge reason to DiFilippo. I first guessed it that I thought DiFilippo was an upgrade over Fedor, and I'm glad to be proven right about that. Because let's be real, Fedor would not have done that smart of a game plan. He wouldn't have. So, great sign for Breakers fans. Now, the last game was the Stallions versus the Maulers. This wasn't a good look for the Stallions. Was, however, a good look for the Maulers. The Maulers ended up losing this game, but if we're being honest, it wasn't due to the fact that, the Maulers were a far worse team. It was the same usual things that kept kicking field goals throughout the game. They had like 4 field goals again. But the reason the Stallions won the game was because they had a lucky kick return touchdown with under like 7 minutes left in the game. And then they ended up having a drive that ended up eating up like 4 minutes of the clock to end the game. Essentially, they won because they had one really, really good kickoff return touchdown. Now, while they probably could have gone and scored another touchdown, the fact is that it's just when you have a kick return touchdown like that, that's really what wins you the game, especially when you had like 3 touchdowns in the fourth quarter. I mean, there's not really much stats or anything to say. It was basically what you'd expect between these two teams, except that, the Stallions should have put up more points than they did. Very weird game, but it just is what it is. As for the players of the week, the first one ended up being Mark Thompson for Offensive Player of the Week. It basically came down to him and Wes Hills, which it probably will be for the whole season, let's be real. Mark had 134 yards rushing on an average of 10 yards per carry for 3 touchdowns. I mean, come on, that's just insane. The dude averaged an insane amount of yards per carries. Even if you get rid of his top rush, he still averaged like 8 yards a carry. So he had himself a day. He had 8 yards receiving, 3 touchdowns. He's already looking like a top 2 running back because, well, him and Wes Hills are probably going to be a great battle for Offensive Player of the Year, which we'll see who wins that. But Mark Thompson definitely deserved the award. Congrats to him. Vontae Diggs of the Breakers, linebacker, won it for a very linebacker-esque performance. He got 12 tackles, 4 of them being solo with a half sack and 2 TFLs. Getting those TFLs is a very huge deal against, the Generals. Essentially, being able to stop them from running the ball very well is a huge way to stop them from winning games. It's a big reason to why the Breakers were able to, get as many drives as they had to, chew up as much clock as they did with their short passing game. So, congrats to him for a basic performance that was, basic for a linebacker that won Player of the Week. Usually you're not going to see, a insane 3-sack performance by just a linebacker, but he did have a very solid performance. Congrats to him. And now the first guy that I actively disagree with winning the Player of the Week. Every other week, or so far this week, I think the fans did a great job at voting. This one I don't. Deon Cain won it because he had a touchdown. He had a kick return touchdown, which, don't get me wrong, that's incredible that he had it. It was a huge deal. It was the biggest reason why they ended up winning the game. But if you get rid of that one, he only averaged like 19 yards per return, which there's been a lot of better performances than that. And the fact is that the competition was far better. Let's be real. Usually there's an offensive, a defensive, and a special teams player of the week from each game that gets nominated, and then there are the 4 that are chosen. This game produced 2. Chris Blewett ended up beating out anyone from the Gamblers Stars game to be on the voting. That's because he went 4 for 4 on field goals. Then Alex Kessman of the Showboats, he missed 1 extra point, but he made 2 of his 3, and he had 2 50-yard plus field goals made and another one. And then Brock Miller, punter for the Generals, had like 4 punts within the 20-yard line, as well as having, an average of like 4 to 3 average yards per punt. The fact that Cain won this like by a pretty substantial mark is not good. I think it's clearly because fans saw it as, oh my God, he kick return touchdown. That's automatic Player of the Week, despite the fact that he was the worst of them all, especially considering the fact that, he didn't even do anything offensively. He had literally 2 targets and he didn't catch a ball. But I digress. Congrats to all of them for winning it, even though I don't think Cain deserved it. Congrats to him anyway. But now in terms of the attendance, the only home game was the Michigan Panthers, where I will say, while it definitely was a decrease from the like 15,000 plus they had last week, it was still a solid probably 12,000 plus this week. And the big reason that I think that's very solid for the Panthers, as you can see, unlike basically every other, home stadium, i.e. the 2, they actually have a very good and diverse group of people on either side of the stadium, home and away side, which I think is a huge deal because whenever you like see a Stallions game and it cuts to like the opposing team sideline, it's like so much more empty than the home side. Same with Memphis, how they literally don't have seats on the other side. But Detroit, Ford Field, it's been great. Both sides have people. Now, hopefully they get back to their winning ways. You're also going to see the attendance keep dipping because it's not looking too good that two of the three teams that have a home stadium are right now not looking great. The Showboats did get a win. But Panthers had another great home stadium appearance this week, so very solid in their attendance. Then the TV ratings. Huge W. Huge win for the league. Look, the XFL has their championship game next week, but this week was the first week where it was just the USFL on TV, and we saw the results. Now, you had the Houston Gambling Stars get $520,000 on Fox. You had the Showboats versus Panthers on NBC get $2.06 million. Then you had the next NBC game of the Breakers versus Generals get $830,000, and the Stallions versus Maulers on FS1 doing $550,000. Three of those games' numbers are important. The Houston-Philadelphia game was bad. It was the least watched broadcast game across either the USFL or XFL. And note, whenever I say this, I'm going back to last year's USFL. I consider basically post-COVID, pre-COVID as two different, eras for the Spring League TV. Attendance, not so much. I don't think attendance is a big deal, but TV it is. So with that being said, this was the worst broadcast game across either league. That was really bad. It got even worse from last week's already bad game. Now, yeah, you could make all the excuses. It's 1 o'clock on a Saturday. It's not prime time. It was competing with Kentucky Derby stuff going on, pre-show at 2 o'clock or whatever. Nah, that was a bad number. But speaking of the Kentucky Derby, the USFL and NBC did a very smart move. They put the Showboats versus Panthers game at Ford Field right after the Kentucky Derby. This ended up being the most watched spring football game since Game 2 of Week 1 of the 2022 USFL season, which was Houston versus Michigan, believe it or not. During that season, the first two games, the first one that was on two different channels had an insane 3 million viewers. But I think the most watched for a single network was the second game because it had 2 million on one network on NBC. This was the best game since then. No XFL game and no other USFL game has done better than that since last year's USFL. So that was a huge win for the league. And then you have the Birmingham versus Pittsburgh, which itself was an incredible showing of 550,000. That game having 550,000 might not sound insane until you realize that's the most watched cable game for the USFL since Game 3 of Week 1 last year. So the first cable game they had last year. This is the best since then. Number is just great. It's better than any ESPN2 number that the XFL had since Week 4. It was better than some ESPN numbers. And note that FS1 and USA are both the bottom of the food chain across the 8 different networks and broadcasts that, either league has. So the fact that this number did as well as it did is a very good sign for the league. Overall, this TV ratings was a huge win. While the Fox number is definitely disappointing, the fact that Fox back-to-back weeks has done bad isn't a good sign. I think a lot of it, yeah, the fake crowd noise hurts. But I think another thing is the fact that they've gotten unlucky with the games. In fact, both of them really were unlucky, two of the broadcast games. If you had that Stallions Maulers game on that Fox slot, or let's just say on the Showboats Panthers slot, it could have been even better. The fact is the preliminary ratings for the Showboats Panthers suggested this game was going to get a lot less than 2 million viewers. But the fact that it was a blowout essentially and the game still had over 2 million viewers meant that a lot of people still did retain viewership from the Kentucky Derby, which is a great sign to get potentially more fans invested in the league. You would like to see that, these huge popular games would be, closer. Basically what the Stallions Maulers was. You had a really close, great game between, one of the more popular teams of the league and the Stallions, and ended up having a great rating for what it was. The Breakers Generals game, you would have wished that game would have been on, the 7:30 p.m. NBC slot, but hey, 830,000 ain't bad. But yeah. Overall, that'll do it for week 4 of the season. With the last thing being the standings, I want to talk about real quick. The standings I want to talk about real quick because I think it's very important to look at how it looks at right now through 4 weeks. We've got a basic feeling on what 2 teams are going to win their division, what 2 teams are already basically out of the playoffs, and what 4 teams are competing. When you look at it, it's very clear the Generals and Breakers are going to win their division. Well, yeah, the Generals are tied with the Panthers right now in record. Let's be real, they are the better team. They're the best team in that division. The fact is they gave the Breakers their closest fight of any team. And the Breakers are clearly the best team in the league, so they're both basically guaranteed playoff locks for the division title. Then the Stars and Showboats, well, the Showboats did get a win. The fact is the Gamblers and Stallions just look way too good right now compared to the Showboats. That's despite the fact that the Stallions didn't even look that good against the Maulers. And the Stars, they got literally no O-line. So it looks like it's going to be the Panthers and Maulers, and then the Stallions and Generals competing for, their division's second spot. It's going to be a fun race. Overall, this has been Zomfox. If you enjoyed this content, make sure to subscribe and hit the bell. We do 3 videos a week at least during the USFL season, and as always, have a great night.